not a Russell.
It's definitely not a Mary Russell, right? So anyway, I'm going to graduate myself down here to a chair and listen to Laurie, and then we do have Mr. Hanson, a longtime customer who's a high school teacher, has read the book and is going to talk to Laurie a little bit from the standpoint of if this were his high school and he were teaching, or whatever it is he wants to say, which I thought would be extremely interesting. Did I put you on the spot? But no. Anyway, he was nice enough to agree to do that. So anyway, have a wonderful time.
Yeah, I think that this would be appropriate. That like the bookshop in Paris, where all the stray people would end up staying with Sylvia Beach in her bookshop. I think that would be fitting here. Yeah, she had a bed that stray authors who were not exactly on bestseller lists, when they washed up in Paris, she'd feed them for a few nights and put them up.
We did that at our house. I was thinking of stray customers.
The customers are a whole different thing.
Customers, I thought maybe would like a dormitory on weeks like this.
Yeah, or just push the chairs together. I've slept in airports before. Thank you for coming out. This has been such a lovely day. I think you should all be out in your gardens because it's just so beautiful out there. But I see we're having a celebration.
We are.
Okay.
We are before.
Okay.
Oh, so this is
lovely.
I'll come back up for a moment. Right. Sorry.
I'm so glad I didn't have dessert.
I should mention to you that the book's formal publication date is tomorrow. So we're having a special party a night early, and so we thought that Laurie should have a cake, and we should make it
Thank you.
festive. Right.
Should we just get out the forks and
Susan's going to take it over there and do that. Susan's our official,
Okay.
you're our official cake person,
So I don't
right?
get to just sit here and.
That's okay.
It's really beautiful. I love the
I'm
roses.
going to
Right.
take its picture and put it on Facebook.
All right, we can do that. Shoot down. All right. So I think they'll probably pass it around and serve it while we're talking, which should be nice, right? Laurie and I went out to dinner and we ate mushroom tacos at Sumo Mayo, which we both love, but you have to pick them up in your hands, and and so I had to scrub off when I got here. I assume you did too, because we were all sticky.
No, they grabbed me and threw me at the book room, and so some people may get interesting marks on their books. So
It'll be hoisin sauce.
Right. Okay. Try again.
This is going to be a rather interesting tour because I actually don't know how to talk about this book because it is so very different. It started with a series of short stories that I'd written over the years. There were originally 6 of them that were published at various times in various places. And as far as the world was concerned, had nothing to do with each other. They were all about separate people, they were all about separate times. One of them was set in the 80s, one of them was modern. One of them had a sort of supernatural element to it. And yet I knew that these short stories were all connected. And indeed, when people ask me to write short stories, which I don't do a lot of, I find short stories really difficult to write because they really take as much world building as a full novel does. But people would ask me, usually friends would say, would you write me a short story? And if I could come up with an idea that seemed to have some kind of echo in this world with the other ones, I would say yes. And so over the years I had done a number of short stories. One of them was nominated for an Edgar Award. It lost to Anne Perry, which was fine. Her story was very nice. But when I decided about 3 years ago that it was time to put these together and to tell the story, I talked to my editor and I said, do you want this project that I'm doing? It's like a mosaic. And she said, well, we don't really want to do an anthology of this kind of story. And I said, no, it's not an anthology, it's a novel, and it's all tied together. Believe me, it is. And she just sort of nodded and said, I don't think so. So that's fine. I wrote about 80 pages. And because some time had passed, I then gave it back to her, and I said, you know, partly because as a writer I'm under contract to do that, to have her turn a project down. I gave it to her, and she said, I love it, I must have it. Which, my own little team of, my team LRK, they call themselves, was really disappointed because they had intended to do this as an ebook original. And so I had to say, no, I'm sorry, Random House is going to do this instead. But the whole book is structured as a kind of mosaic. The pieces fit together. There is a rhythm to the story that it's startling at first if you're accustomed to Mary Russell's voice, because it really is very, very different. It's a fascinating experience to write something that is so very, very different. Because with Russell, she starts out and she has long sentences, long words. The Beekeeper's Apprentice has long chapters, so they got shorter as time went past. But you know, there's a very stretched out sense of time in those books. And this one is pieces. It's pieces. It's pieces. And in fact, the idea of a mosaic appears as one of the images in the book, that there is a mosaic in the school that's pieced together out of objects that came from the school. And it tells the story of the school by these little jagged shards that come together and make a final image. And that's what I was aiming for in the book, is to have a story that is made of pieces, so that you have these kids, you have adults, you have the principal and her husband, and the various tales are all wrapped around each other. One of the things that really fascinated me in the writing of it was the lives of the kids, because this is set in a middle school. I'm not sure, do you have middle schools in Arizona or junior highs? Middle school, so it's a 3-year. And I was always troubled when my kids were going through school at the huge difference between a 6th grader and an 8th grader. I mean, a 6th grader is a child, and an 8th grader is an adult. And you have this dynamic that goes on in a school that is sometimes troubling, because really it's not appropriate to have a 6th grader and an 8th grader thinking the same kinds of thoughts. On the other hand, it's very good for both ends of the spectrum, because it speeds up the one and slows down the other. But this is set in a middle school, and I was fascinated with the idea of how you get a community out of these disparate individuals, how you build a community from these kids who basically won't talk to adults because they're kids. The adults who think they understand the kids, but don't. The kids who talk to each other without saying things. The adults who don't say things because they're afraid of what they may hear in response. And all these currents are going on in the school, as well as having these 22 visiting people there to talk about their jobs. And you know, a career day is when you have people like me who arrive at the school and talk about their jobs. I tend not to do career days anymore, because I found that kids were getting far too excited about the idea of being a writer. And I thought, this is not a good idea. This is a fantasy that we really probably shouldn't encourage. Much better to think of, you know, dental hygienist and firefighter and that kind of thing. So, but you know, that's the idea, is that people come and they talk about their life, how they trained, what they love about their job, the drawbacks of the job, and how you go about getting into the job. So it's the fantasy and the reality and all of these life stories coming together in this middle school on this one particular day. So it's structured as a thriller, because it moves by time. You start just after midnight and you go until the afternoon. And in the course of this day, you learn all these things about these individuals. So it's all about the characters and their backgrounds and their lives and their motivations. So that's where it comes from. Do you want to ask me a few questions?
I've got a couple. It was hard coming up with questions
I'll repeat them.
without giving anything away. So
Okay, do you want to?
I guess my first question was, why did you choose to do middle school kids versus high school kids? The 12 to 14 gap versus the 14 to 18 gap.
Why the middle school? The middle school, like I said, yeah. Like I said, I mean, the middle school is this odd combination of children and adults. You have kids who clearly are a long way from adolescence. And you have kids who are on the edge of shaving every day. You have girls who are thoroughly developed physically, but still have, you know, unicorn stickers on their backpacks. It's a fascinating step between elementary and high school. And the changes that take place in these kids are enormous, not only physically, but mentally and emotionally. And it always struck me as interesting how kids of that age act like children when they're on the playground. It is a playground. You know, they sound like kids at play. And yet, they have teen pregnancies at this same age. This is a problem for the principals. Drugs and teen pregnancies and gang involvement. So that these kids are in this really fascinating and dangerous and lively point in their lives. That many adults just sort of don't see, because it just looks like they're these sort of adolescents who worry about things they shouldn't.
The thing that really stood out about your book, I'm a junior high, I teach junior high and high school, and the difference between junior high kids and high school kids is phenomenal. And what I loved about your characters, your kids are real. Your kids are very, very realistic, real kids. Do you think, when you were selling these kids to your publisher, or do you think that, was there any pushback? It's like, you're giving these kids way too many adult issues, and you're having 12 and 13-year-old kids and 14-year-old kids, but they're dealing with adult problems and they're making adult decisions. In the real world of junior high, that's exactly what they're doing, but I think most adults have no clue that's what's going through the minds of our 13 or 14-year-olds. So I love the voice that you gave these kids.
None of the people that I work with in the publishing house had any particular objections to that. They did have objections to, for example, one of the kids, Nick, has a very adult kind of vocabulary and way of thinking. And I have toned that down somewhat in the book, because I sort of agreed with them. On the other hand, a book like this has constant decisions to make as a writer. I have to decide, am I going to present these kids as they look from the outside? All right, so that they're obsessed with you know, the social media and their phones and what kind of clothes they're wearing and what shoes they have and who's got more expensive shoes and whether this person said this to that person or the other. This constant barrage of shallow concerns that yet hit these kids deeply. Or did I want to make them feel like adults in young bodies? Because I think that middle school kids feel like that. Maybe not the younger ones, but certainly by 8th grade. These kids feel like adults. They have adult problems, they have adult concerns. The only problem is the adults around them don't agree. And so that, I think, is why so many kids stop talking to adults, because it's clear there's no communication going on there. If you are assuming that the other person is filled with shallow concerns, then why are they going to bother sharing those concerns with you? So that I think that the kids, you know, I toned down the brand names, the social media names, the kinds of slang that they would use. I mean, the speech of the kids in the book is a little more formal than you would hear in a schoolyard. On the other hand, it's how the kids think that they're talking. The kids feel that they are carrying on adult conversations. So that's, from their point of view, that's what I was aiming at.
Well, I think you did a phenomenal job actually hitting that. With the thing with the junior high kids, for my friends that are not teachers, they think that all I dealt with this year was dabbing, fidget spinners, and bottle flipping, and because those were the trends in the middle school.
Now, does anyone understand what all three of those things are?
No.
Okay.
Okay, fidget spinners we all have seen on the
Oh,
list, okay.
Bottle flipping is you take a bottle of water that's got about an inch of water at the bottom and you toss it in the air and you try to make it land standing straight up. And these
Why?
kids, because it's fun.
And
They
you
will.
film every time.
Oh, yeah.
Because one of those times you'll succeed, and then you have it on, then you can post it
Well,
on YouTube.
they try to land them on top of fire extinguishers, on top of the balconies,
100 times.
on the flagpole. Where can we get these things to land? And when they succeed, you can tell because they're
Hey kids,
everywhere.
shall we try it?
And what was the third one?
Dabbing. That's just I don't know. It's weird. It's just they do that, and they think that's the cool. They go like this, and they think that's the coolest thing in the world. But you.
Can you demonstrate that, because people watching this can't see it? That?
Yeah, that's pretty much
It's
it.
I've seen people.
yeah, it's a sort of
It's got two different places where it comes from. So
yeah.
one's not so good, and one of them's cool. But
Yeah,
Yeah.
and all the kids assume that it's cool. So yeah.
they do.
Yeah.
But I liked what I liked is that you gave these kids a voice, because they are so much more than that. And I think you make your adults successful with these kids, because you've got some of your adults that treat these kids the way that they're going to want to be treated as they grow up, and that's kind of the secret to dealing with them. Look, I'm going to treat you this way, and you do that to encourage behavior rather than I'm going to treat you the way you're acting versus I'm going to treat you the way that, I don't know how to put this, I don't want to give anything away, so
Yeah.
I have to stop.
Again, without giving anything away, one of the interesting, but I am not an outliner. I never really know where my books are going. And this book, because I wasn't writing it beginning to end, it was fitting pieces together and making them complement each other. I was even more so. So I got to what was in effect the end of it, not having any conscious idea of how the book was going to end. But I mean, it's fascinating that as a writer, I am fascinated by the process of a mind like mine, because I am quite sure that there is an ending there. And I'm quite sure that the ending is the thing that goes with this particular story, and that it has exactly the flavor that I need. And it didn't come out until I was actually at the spot where, you know, all of these things have happened, this catastrophe is on the edge, and at that point I knew exactly what the scene was that would end it. And to trust to the method is just a fascinating thing. And I think that
You couldn't have written this book a long time ago.
I couldn't have written it a long
Because
time
you
ago.
wouldn't have had enough confidence.
No. When I first started writing, I had to know the final scene. I never wrote it down, but I had to have a sense of who was still standing when the dust settled, kind of thing. But over the years, I've come to to feel much more that writing is what they used to call a faith-based initiative. And and to know the sense of when the back of my head was satisfied with the progress of the story. That I find that if there's something going wrong with the story, I tend to get fidgety, and I want to go clean the oven. It's not really writer's block, but I just find an awful lot of other things that I want to do, and it isn't until I get back and I look at the thing and see where it's going off that I can find it back onto the track. And with this one, it was that way, that I knew that ending was just there waiting for me. Like it was sitting on a shelf in a file folder. I knew the sensation of it being there, and I was very glad I was right. It was something of a relief to start writing and think, all right, so that's how it happens. Oh, thank God.
Would you ever go back to any of these characters? Or is this, I mean, we were talking about that earlier, but.
It's, again, without giving things away and who's standing at the end, it's hard because this is so clearly a standalone novel. And you can't go back to the day after career day, because it doesn't fit, and the people are not in the same place. Those of whom are still with us. But at the very end, there's a sort of coda that happens as an afterword that explains what has happened after career day. It's the final day of school in June. And I think there's a situation that occurs there that would be fun to explore in the future without going into details. But yeah, I think that situation that occurs towards the end would someday be interesting to look at. Which none of you understand what I'm talking about.
All right, so now that we've done all that, let's, without talking about what happens to them, introduce just a few of the characters that you bring in. And one of them is Brother Erasmus from...
Oh, seriously?
Yeah, I wrote a book. Well, my bachelor's thesis, my BA thesis at UC Santa Cruz was the role of the fool in Western culture.
Well, as one would.
I went to Santa Cruz. What could I say?
Which didn't even exist when I was an undergraduate at Stanford. There was no UC Santa Cruz. It was just Berkeley.
No, and they built it in the 60s, and I was not the first graduating class, but about the fourth or fifth. And yeah, UCSC, we used to call it Uncle Charlie's summer camp.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, it was definitely right.
We only thought of Santa Cruz in Palo Alto as a beach camp.
Yeah, it was a beach town. Our mascot is the banana slug. So go slugs. Okay. This gentleman here knows what I'm talking about. Okay. I loved the idea of the Holy Fool. And so when I was writing the Kate Martinelli books, I wanted to write a story about a holy fool. What would a holy fool look like in modern life? I mean, it doesn't go in modern life. It's a feudal kind of person. But I thought it would be fascinating to see what he would look like. And so that's where Brother Erasmus came. It was the second of the Martinelli books, is called To Play the Fool. A number of years later, Mike Connolly asked me to do a short story for a collection called The Blue Religion.
Right.
And The Blue Religion is obviously about cops. And I thought it would be kind of interesting to look at what a different cop, found with the same character, Brother Erasmus, in the town that I was living in at the time, which was Watsonville, California, which is even less of a feudal society than San Francisco is. Yeah,
No, it's the artichoke.
Yeah.
No, yes, no, I know that because we ate artichokes 5 nights a week in the dorm at Stanford. I'd never even seen an artichoke from Chicago until I arrived there, and then it was artichoke heaven. after that, but it's because they were so plentiful. Gilroy is the garlic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Pretty sure Gilroy's the garlic kid.
Castroville.
Oh, yeah.
Castroville is
Castroville.
artichokes.
Oh, is it?
Sorry, honey.
Oh, you're right. I'm sorry. Well, what's Watsonville?
Watsonville is everything else. It is what it is.
Strawberries.
Oh,
Everything
okay.
else. In fact,
Strawberries.
90% of the Brussels sprouts that this country eats comes from.
I love strawberries.
Well, that's one reason I will never go there. Okay, you're absolutely right. I forgot about Castro.
Local history, but yeah.
Sorry to take you off the words
well,
later.
yeah. No, I wanted to write this character, Brother Erasmus, and so he encounters. He's a man who's had some real problems in his past, and he therefore speaks entirely in quotations. And so the Kate Martinelli character had problems with this, and this other cop in what was sort of thinly disguised Watsonville had problems with this, and that is one of the stories that appears in this book. So
There's even a shade of Kate Martinelli, or at least a
Yeah.
communication
yeah,
with
there's
Kate.
a conversation with Kate on the phone. So
Right. Some of you who've read A Grave Talent and the other ones would probably like to see Kate again. If you really want to see a great demonstration of a holy fool, it's not entirely medieval, but Mussorgsky's opera Boris Godunov, much of it depends on a holy fool. He's a soloist in the opera, and it's actually a very Russian concept too, as well as feudal. So if you've never seen Boris Godunov or whatever, which is a fabulous opera, by the way, you can see the role that holy fools play. They were actually a real societal force and had a big impact. So another person that appears is Paletta Man, and that's from your Edgar-nominated short story. So what can you tell us about it? Him.
the original short story for Paleta Man was this old Hispanic gent who pushed one of those three-wheel carts around and sold ice creams and popsicles to the kids. And of course, somebody like that walking the streets day and night sees everything going on in the community, sees who's employed and who's beating his wife and who's selling drugs, and so he is a key character in the book because he's moved up in life from selling ice creams to the school janitor. He's become the school janitor.
Custodian.
Yeah. So he regards himself as the school custodian, which is a position of authority that is the word custody to guard. And so he thinks of himself as being the school's guardian in a number of ways. He's also a somewhat shady character because he has, you don't quite understand his motivations for quite some time. And I think perhaps not to go into it too deeply either, but he has plans for a couple of the kids that you're not really sure about. So.
I thought he was a really fascinating character. Now, is Gordon a new character that you brought into this book?
Gordon was one of the original stories. It was called The Salt Pond. And Gordon, my husband and I went to Papua New Guinea for our honeymoon, as one does. As academics, you kind of fit in honeymoons in with, sabbaticals and world tours and such like. So we spent some time up in the highlands of Papua New Guinea and met this mad Brit there, and who stuck in my mind for a number of years until I decided to write a story about a mad Brit who lived in Papua New Guinea. And so Gordon was born, and his relationship with the woman who becomes the principal at this school is what brings him into this story. So
He's a great character. I really like him. Who am I missing? We've talked about the Lady Man. We've talked about Brother Ambrose, Gordon.
well, you have the coach, who's Nick's grandfather. Nick is one of the kids who has a lot of psychological problems. There's been a girl who disappeared from the school some months earlier, and Nick was good friends with her and is very disturbed by her disappearance. This idea of, you learn early on in the book that a gun comes to campus, so that you know that something is going to happen. But throughout the book, the sense of loss comes from this missing child that nobody quite knows what happened to. And they don't know if they should have a memorial service. They don't know if they, it's an impossible thing to address in a place like a school, because you don't know what to say to kids. You don't know what to say. You can't say, you will be fine. You can't say, she's someone that we missed, that she's dead, because they don't know. And so this sense of loss is a thing that permeates the book and brings the kids together in a lot of ways that otherwise they would not. I've always been one of those people that hated a book with 5,712 characters you can keep track of. So it's somewhat ironic that I now have a book that has 5,712 characters. And I think that I worked very closely to try and make sure that you never are scratching your head saying, now who is this? What is this person doing? So that each of these little chapters has to contain something that is specifically to do with that individual. One of my favorites who appeared and who wasn't in any of the stories before is Chaco. Chaco is a kid who has the gangs pulling him on one side, who feels responsible to help his mother on the other side, who feels that he should be standing up and acting like a man. But this girl is so cute. And so, Chaco keeps trying to prove himself, and you're afraid that he's going to really come to a disastrous and sticky end, because he feels that he needs to stand up and identify with his cousin who's under trial.
So, going way back in our history, I hope I remember this right, you actually wrote The Beekeeper's Apprentice first, but A Grave Talent was the first book that published.
Yeah.
Do I have that right?
Yeah.
So, many of you who are Mary Russell fans may forget that Laurie has written books that are contemporary, set in today's world and so forth. And you wrote, how many Martinellis?
There's 5 Martinellis.
Right, and then you wrote Folly, which is in many ways many people's favorite.
My first standalone was the thriller Darker Place.
That's right, and that was the woman that was the religious sort of, she was part of
religious
a,
cults, yes.
Right.
That was 97 or 8.
Okay, and then you wrote a book about the war veterans, 2 of them actually, I think. Keeping Watch, and
Yeah,
wasn't there?
Folly is tied in with Keeping Watch.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and then, what am I missing here? Something? Touchstone, right. Although that's not,
That's a sort of miniature series of 2 now.
yeah, but that's not thoroughly contemporary, right? Yeah, so, you've been, so I guess my question I was trying to set up this thing
Yes.
for was, how hard was it for you to come back to today's world when you've been writing about, Russell and Holmes a century ago for so long? It's a different thing.
Yeah. One of the early, I was with St. Martin's Press for quite a while, and one of their early sales conferences, they handed out a flyer to all the sales reps. The top of it says, "What Laurie R King writes next is always a mystery." Because I wrote A Grave Talent, which is a story about a modern day cop in San Francisco. And then I wrote The Beekeeper's Apprentice, which is a story of a young woman who meets and becomes the apprentice of Sherlock Holmes in 1915 to 1919. And then I published To Play the Fool. And by that time, the reviewers started saying, we think this is the same person who wrote, but we're not really sure. So, you know, I started out doing this alternating.
Right.
And writing a Russell and a Martinelli, or a Russell and a standalone. And I really like living in different worlds in alternating years. I really dislike having to write the same era, the same vocabulary, the same kinds of concerns year in, year out. And so I write these ones, and I always adore moving into a new world, because I'm exploring an entirely new world. Oddly enough, you know, this particular world in lockdown it's based on a town that I lived in for years. I mean, it's physically and economically, and you know, even the structure of the roads and the schools is pretty much Watsonville, California, where I lived for a number of years.
Not the artichoke capital, we know.
Yeah.
Right.
We grow strawberries in Watsonville, so you know, we're strawberry.
Whatever.
But you know, I loved being able to take this town that I lived in for 30 years and make it different, make it something else, and to show my love for it, because it's one of those, you know, one of those California towns that just feels very, very real.
One other question, which is sort of related to your question, is do they actually have career days for middle schools? Or is that too, because I don't remember them except in high school.
I had
But they're now doing them at an earlier stage, right?
We do one.
That's great.
I
I get a
think
presentation once at a middle school.
Did you?
Librarian.
Yeah.
Or career day.
I think in high schools, they tend to take kids out of the school, and, you know, by that time, the kids are narrowing down the sorts of things. So you tend to do, you know, visit a factory, or visit,
Yeah.
you know, Google or whatever.
This is more modern than I recall. I'm older than you are by 10 years, so it's sort of hard for me to.
We're getting old, Barbara.
I know, but I'm older than you. And we just didn't do that. I mean, I had a very progressive high school, Nutria High School, Winnick, Illinois still is, and we did stuff like, you know, read the great books and, you know, speed reading and things like that, but we never really got into, because everybody was going on to a liberal arts education, and some 99% of my high school went to college, and most of them went back east. It just wasn't part of my reality as a youngster.
And I think that's one of the reasons why they tend to do it in middle school, is because
Yeah,
in a school like Guadalupe Middle School, you have pressure from outside on these kids to not go on to high school. I mean, you have work to do.
right.
You, you know, you should be earning money. You should be taking your place in the family. There's a lot of pressures from outside, and if you show these kids exciting things that, yeah, you can do this,
Right.
it encourages them to think of not only the high school before them, but what might be on the other side. That, you know, that you too have the brains and the ability, and can get help to do this job, this function, to
Plus,
meet your
realistically,
dreams.
more practical training is a good thing, I think, more vocational training. Not everybody needs to go to college, or a liberal arts education doesn't, you could be a bookseller like me. Patrick, I'll never forget this one time. I was writing one of the book newses, and I was waxing long on the historical section, because there was a whole ton of historical fiction. And Patrick came up to me, he said, "It's amazing," he said, "how'd you have time to look all this stuff up?" And I just looked at it for a minute, and I said, "I didn't look any of it up, Patrick, I already know it." You know, I mean, that was the difference, you know. I really did know it, and I was just remembering, you know, but I thought that was, I have a grandson who graduated from high school, and his deal is 3D printing. You know, he's not gonna go to college, but he's really terrific at, you know, this kind of thing, and I think we need more of that. You know, people actually know how to do things, you know. I mean, speaking as a homeowner, you really want people who know how to do things and whatever. So I think it's great. I just wasn't sure that it was a current trend. Now, having written Lockdown, what are you now engaged? I already know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask her anyway. What are you now engaged in?
I've had a kind of busy spring, and I have a deadline that's fast approaching. So yeah,
On
so
this first section.
Barbara knows that I've spent the last 2 days, you know, working my way through those kinds of books that sort of moths fly out of when you open them.
Or in your case, mildew, since it's Venice.
Yeah, yeah. Russell and Holmes are going to go to Venice, and Holmes will hate it. Venice is impossible to pin down. I mean, you can't. Nothing about it is clear cut.
Right. Laurie was showing me her pictures of her iPad, but I was showing her Peru and she was showing me Venice. It was interesting. And speaking of Peru and thinking about schools, one of the things that I thought was fascinating in this recent trip that I took, Peru, over 40% of the population of Peru is kids. Unlike, say, Japan or even our country, you know, where the population is aging out, or Britain, where they don't have enough kids to pay for the pensions and whatever. Peru is just booming with children. And so what they've been having to do, they only have so many facilities, is that the young kids go in the morning from 7:30 to noon or something like that, or 1, and then the next bunch, the middle school kids, go, or high school, whatever, in the afternoon, and then in the evening in the same building they do some adult education classes. So basically it's a school factory that is running a lot of hours, you know, trying to accommodate all of these. And I think that's such an interesting, you know, question is what do you do when you have too many kids and not enough schools? Whereas here in Scottsdale, aren't we actually closing schools because you don't have enough kids?
Yeah, my kids went to school at a time when there was a great bulge in the school-age population,
Right.
so we had year-round school. I mean, we had, all the kids would be going, I think we had 3 months on and 1 month off, so that, which we had 4 tracks.
Yeah.
So, you know, the school buildings were full all year round.
Right,
Just with different kids.
right. You know, so, I mean, the
I
whole,
hated it.
but the whole school concept is sort of evolving, you know, school year. Isn't that another thing happening here is that the vacation thing is shifting and it's not like you're off all summer? You know, that old farm, you know, agricultural thing is kind of down the drain, and also kids learn better if they're not out for 3 months. So what are you getting, longer breaks in the middle of the year and then a shorter summer? Right, so I mean, it's a whole different, you know, rhythm for kids, I think. That makes a lot of sense. Anyway, do any of you have questions that you'd like to ask Laurie?
I actually got into your books on audiobooks, checking them out from the library because they did a lot of cross-country driving. And so then I, you know, buy the book. And so I still listen to audiobooks, and as I'm flipping through the pages here, it's very visual, like the lists and everything like that. Is there a plan to do audio, or you had mentioned an ebook earlier?
The question is about audiobooks. She listens to audiobooks, and this book has a couple of things in it that are visual, so that it has a list. It has a newspaper clipping, as it were. They probably will read that. The audiobook should be out tomorrow. I think they were doing it simultaneous. It might be slightly delayed. Sometimes they are, but they had intended to get it out simultaneously. I'm not sure how they set that apart. Whether they just say at the top a newspaper cutting, because that chapter does start with from the whatever the name of the newspaper is. I don't remember, but. Yeah, it's always tricky to try and get a reader to do something like that, and it'll be interesting to see what this one does. Did you?
Oh, yeah. This is just sort of a technical question because I like Russell books. That's why I started Found You, and I just wanted to picture you writing them. Do you write it on your computer? And, you know, is it like every day?
Yeah,
It
the
sounds like
question is my writing habits. Yeah. Yeah, I tend to write pretty much every day when I have especially when I have a first draft going. I will be writing every day, all day, every day for the next couple of months because my deadline is fast approaching. So yes, as soon as this tour is over, I will disappear from the world. Yeah, I tend to write a first draft fairly rapidly anyway, and then spend a lot of time with the rewrite. My first drafts tend to be kind of short, like 300, 350 pages, and the final draft is more like 450. Depends on the book. I mean, this one was probably 450 of typescript, which gets cut down in the pagination on when they print it up. But yeah, my first drafts are sort of expanded outlines.
She used to get pretty.
I use a laptop. Yeah.
Yeah.
I used to write. My first 7 or 8 books were done by hand. I used to write longhand with a fountain pen. Because with a fountain pen, you can, you're not pushing. You're not a ballpoint pen. You're holding it hard, and your hand gets really tired. But with a fountain pen, a good fountain pen. There's no effort. You can write and write and write. Because nobody can read your writing. But that's the
At some point, you have to actually translate it into.
Yeah, I had a good typist too, who occasionally would make interesting mistakes. There was one that I will never forget. At the front part of The Beekeeper's Apprentice, in fact, there's a scene where Russell has come across Sherlock Holmes sitting on the Sussex Downs, and he says, "Young man," and she says, "Young man," and she whips off her hat and shows her long braids, and she says, "If that's all that's left of the great detective's mind and on," but my typist converted it into, "If that's all that's left of the great detective's smurd." Instead of apostrophe S, mind, it was capital S, M-I-R-D. So I've always wanted to write a story about the great detective Smurd. So
That'd be a really inside story.
I know, the great detective Smurd. So speaking of which, you haven't mentioned that I have a short story in your Poison Pen collection. There's another short story in
there is a Bound for Mystery. Laurie wrote a story, actually kind of her history of her relationship with me in the bookstore.
It's how Mary Russell came to the other bookstore and had a conversation with Barbara Peters.
That's right.
You didn't know that.
We had to review. I mean, it's been almost 30 years. It's hard to remember back to the very early days of the store and, try to remember. Laurie also has a volume called Mary Russell's War, in which she wrote the murder of Mary Russell. So as you know, the actual wedding got glossed over in the novels. So we have that as well. And then you do know also that Laurie has edited 3 anthologies with her friend Leslie Klinger, Sherlock Holmes anthologies. Although, do you actually have stories in it? I can't remember. I didn't think so.
Now, there was one that Les and I wrote. The very first was the one that you guys did as the paper version.
Right.
Has,
A study in Sherlock.
Has a Twitter exchange between Russell and Les Klinger.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So we have
she is not amused.
right. We have a history of publishing some of Laurie's work. Random House, St. Martin's, Poison Pen Press. And part of that is because original ebook publishing, Random House doesn't necessarily want to do a print version because it's just not in their game plan. So we've had a long career together doing projects. And then, as you know, we wrote a book together about our trip going through Japan, all about Toto. There's a great toilet museum in Tokyo.
You gotta read
We're
that.
not in
It's
Kansas
really fun.
anymore. Toto.
Right.
Just Toto is the brand of toilet that we fell in love with in Japan.
Which I've installed in my house, and now my husband wants one.
So the kind that are heated.
Yes. They're wonderful.
That's
If you once have a Toto, you can't imagine life without it.
But you're not going to put one in the guest room because your guests will never leave.
Probably true.
Yeah.
I discovered while traveling this time, and this is a little off color, but nonetheless, your Toto toilet, among all its other features, it rises, the seat rises to greet you, so it opens automatically when you walk in. And I found myself in the middle of the night in Peru in luxury hotels just standing there by the toilet, waiting for the toilet. I'm really glad my daughter's asleep. It doesn't see her mother, standing in front of the toilet waiting for it all to go up. I mean, really, you just get so used to it, and it's heated, and it's wonderful and comfortable and tall. So my husband now has serious toilet envy. And when we remodeled his bathroom, I asked him if he wanted, didn't want to spend the money or whatever. Now he's truly repining. Now that he's older and it's, it hurts to, whatever. So there we are. Anyway, if you once have a Toto, you can't. But really, our trip to Japan might be the cleanest country in the entire world. they have gardens in the bathrooms. Every bathroom, every public restroom has its own attendant. They're little gods. You know, they do ikebana for your bathroom. They have scented towels. I'm talking about just an ordinary restroom here. And they have onsen. Japan is on, you know, the Ring of Fire, so it's volcano. And like New Zealand and other places, there are hot springs. And so the Japanese had taken hot spring and bathing to a high art, and they're called onsen in Japan. And we visited several. And you have to bathe before you could go into the bath. That's just the deal. Even if you're in a hotel and they have a wooden tub, it's only for soaking, so you're required. Remember gyms where you had to, you know, shower in the gym before you could go in the pool? It's the same deal. So it takes some getting used to, but I don't know that I've ever been as clean as I was when Laurie and Rob and I went around Japan, right? It was so much fun. And my favorite hotel, we got there by accident because we got lost, because we didn't read the Kanji GPS properly, and we're in the middle of nowhere in Shikoku. And we wind up staying in a Japanese ryokan because we are completely lost and it's gotten dark and they took pity on us. And when you do that, you sleep on mats on the floor and they have a very formal dinner. But there's always a bathing thing, and so we put on our suits, Rob and I went out into that, and then we looked out in the garden and we saw there was a little wooden cable car and it trundled up the mountain because the real onsen was way up on top of the mountain. So it's like 10 o'clock at night and it's freezing. But Rob and I get in, we ride the little cable car up to the top of the mountain. And their signal is, I'm trying to remember the colors, but there's the men's and there's the women's. And then the purple one says that you can both go in together. So we're the only people probably within like 100 miles, you know, going up to this onsen. But Rob and I very carefully go to the purple one, and we sit in there and we're looking out at the stars and the whole bit, and the water is bubbling away, and it's just an experience you can't have. The only place in the United States that I know if you can do this is in Santa Fe. Have any of you been to 10,000 Waves in Santa Fe? It's on the road out to the ski resort, and a very far-seeing developer put a Japanese onsen, only it's artificial. I mean, it's not an actual hot springs. And so you can do that. You can be in a starry night in Santa Fe in your plunge tub, and it's hot, and you're looking out over the mountains. So if you ever want to actually experience that.
Big Sur.
Do they have one in Big Sur?
Oh, yeah, and they're natural hot springs.
Oh, they're real
right
hot
over
springs.
there, yeah.
And Calistoga, doesn't Calistoga have actual hot springs?
Yeah.
Right. Well, they're probably all over, but I don't know another one on a mountain. But I didn't realize that Big Sur was like that.
I think Big Sur actually looks out over the ocean, so yeah.
Oh, there you are. So you can have this experience.
If
Right.
you ever came to visit me.
I'm not on book tour. Nevertheless, we're getting off target. Does anybody have a final question they might like to ask
I
Laurie?
have a final.
Susan has a question.
I would like you to speak briefly about your Anatomy of Innocence project that you are involved with.
The question is about the Anatomy of Innocence Project. My buddy Les Klinger, who dragged me into a number of Sherlock Holmes anthologies, is a lawyer, and he's good friends with a woman named Laura Colwell, who is also a lawyer. The two of them are involved in the Innocence Project, which is all about exonerating the falsely accused. And Laura started an organization that is a subsidiary one, which is meant for people who are released, who are given a new trial or found not guilty and and released, but have been in prison for 30 years and have zero skills, zero knowledge of the world, and nowhere to go or live or be. And so the two of them decided they wanted to do a project that tells the story of a typical, although there's no such thing, a typical conviction, a false conviction. And what they did was divide up 15 different stories into slices, so that the first slice is the knock on the door. It's a woman who was a law student, in fact, who thought she was being brought in to testify against someone, and in fact was arrested for his murder. each of these individuals, the next one is a person who was basically tortured for information. The third one is the trial. I wrote the third one. Each of these slices of people's lives and experiences is individual but typical. And each of them is written up by a different crime writer. So that S.J. Roseanne, Sarah Paretsky, me, Lee Child wrote one. 15 different top writers all telling the stories of these individuals. So that when you get to the end, you have experienced the lives of these individuals who were falsely accused, found guilty for any number of reasons, from a bad lawyer to fake evidence, and eventually found someone who would listen to them and believe them and fight their way to freedom. And so we wrote a book, the 15 of us who wrote these chapters. The book is called The Anatomy of Innocence. And the proceeds go to the Innocence Project. So there's a number of events
Isn't it
around.
run out of Chicago?
Her section of it is run out of Chicago. And Laura and Les are doing events in various places in San Francisco. It'll be the 28th of June in Scottsdale.
Here, it'll be October 27th. They're actually coming out to speak to the Arizona bar. And then we'll do an event here at the store, with or without Lori, depending on her schedule, but Les and Laura will be here for sure. Scott Turow wrote the introduction. Sarah Presky is just Chicago. Or Michael Harvey, who's a wonderful writer, wrote a whole book, in fact, I think it was actually called The Innocence Project or something similar, a thriller, but nonetheless, the story was about somebody who had been falsely convicted in this project. Do I remember that John Grisham has had a lot to do with it? Am I right about that, or some other lawyer writer, I think, has been instrumental, not in your book, but in the actual Innocence Project itself. Do you know, Susan?
I don't know.
I think I've got that. I might be wrong, but I kind of think.
Taro, you mentioned it.
Well, I know that Scott does, but I don't think he's the one I'm thinking of. It doesn't matter. Anyway, it may even be housed at Northwestern University, part of it, to try to overcome.
But the book itself is powerful and moving, and oddly hopeful. I mean, the one thing that all of us writers found with these people, because I think all of us had conversations, either face to face or on the phone, with our exonerees, and the lack of bitterness is extraordinary. I mean, these are people who lost 20, 23. My guy lost 28 years of his life. He went in, at this guy hanging out at his mom's house in his 20s, and he came out a middle-aged man who had no skills. And yet, there's not a bitterness. He's grateful to be able to breathe free air, and to have people know that he didn't do it. And I mean, that to me is extraordinary.
I agree. I hope some of you will be able to come in October for that particular event. Thanks, Susan, for bringing that up. Anybody else have a final comment or question? No. In that case, I want to thank you all so much for coming this evening. Lori and I both greatly appreciate it. You got cake too, so listen. Yay. And there's more cake. So let's give Lori a round of applause. And Lori's going to wander over to that little wooden table and sign your books, and you can take photographs and chat with her and whatever. If you're going to take a photo, please turn your flash off, because otherwise it blinds her. If you don't know how to do that, ask Miles, who's right back there. Also, we recorded this program. It's on our live stream. You can access it on our website on the live stream, so you can share this event with other people. Right? Right. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.